Hey there, welcome back to the last question. This is part two um, of a discussion on the Japanese-American internment, otherwise known as when America did concentration camps. Um, that may sound like I'm saying it in jest, but really I don't want to be flippant about this. Professor Matt Estes, professor of history at Palomar College in Southern California near the San Diego area or in the metro San Diego area. Welcome back. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
doing a second session with me. I probably could have known going into last session we recorded, which in real time was 2 days ago, that I would simply have too many questions and we would have too many rabbit holes to choose from to make it a single session deal. So, um, hopefully, for listeners, if you're listening to this episode, if this happens to be the first episode you come across, I highly, highly, highly recommend you listen to part one first. We're not going to do much of a recap. We're going to launch into more or less where we left off. There were a couple of threads we left somewhat hanging, and then probably personal story time or two will come toward the end from the way, way, way back machine. And especially if you're on YouTube, you'll probably get to enjoy that, or it'll annoy you, and then you can just stop listening early. So yeah, Matt, thanks again. Um, the Japanese American internment, there was a lot of history in detail we talked about in the last session, but I think we were just talking off recording about starting with what happened to the Japanese American community after the fact. So maybe paint the picture, if you would. What was life like for Japanese Americans on the West Coast? You talked a bit about that first session, um, but then what was it like, especially after the war? After the camps are closing down and now they're attempting to return home or attempting to return to something like normal life.
Yeah, that's a great question. So at first, it's interesting. Some people actually did not come back to the West Coast. They were kind of afraid of the reception they might get, and they ended up in places like Cleveland, or people like my grandparents stayed in Denver for a while. They didn't come back, and then others did try to come back, although usually. They tried to come back kind of as a community. So there were people who, internees, Japanese Americans, who would get out of the camps or were already out of the camps. They kind of made, arrangements with those who were still in the camps, and they kind of made scouting parties. Like somebody would go back to San Diego or back to Los Angeles or back to Seattle and kind of scope out the situation, and then report back and say, okay. This is what it's like. These are the things we should worry about. And if you've got a quick second, I think I mentioned this last time, if I could just, yeah. So this is kind of some of the stuff they returned to, unfortunately. Um, can you see this?
Yeah, yes, I can. And I think we talked briefly about the Buddhist temple, sort of the,
Yes.
the warehousing attempt they made.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a picture of what happened. So you can see it. They've obviously
Yeah.
cleared out a lot of the material. This is after the fire. But again, it basically burned everything that had been stored. So that's one thing they came back to. Another was this. This is a famous photograph of a Japanese American family. Coming back to Seattle, and this is what their home looked like. The windows had been broken in, and there'd been graffiti all over it. So there was a lot of resistance to them coming back. There was also official resistance. I believe we left off talking about Earl Warren saying I don't want them back in in my state, about the various civic groups, about the and I think I might have sent this to you in the massive collection of documents that I use when I teach. But
Mhm.
there's and again, this is just one example, but there's a formal resolution by the San Diego City Council saying that we don't want the Japanese back, and they're appealing to their congressional delegation to, put pressure on, the military and pressure on the War Relocation Authority to prevent the Japanese from returning. So yeah, this is what we're seeing, and then this is kind of what I was talking about last time. Before the war, there were Japanese American neighborhoods, much like there were ethnic neighborhoods of all different types. Um, like I'm sure people are familiar with like, Chinatowns. And if you're from the West Coast, there's like, Little Saigon up in Orange County. It's, these various ethnic neighborhoods. Well, for the Japanese in San Diego, it was in downtown, near where Petco Park is today. So basically between like G and J Street and, 4th Avenue and, maybe, 11th or 12th. I mean, obviously people live beyond that, but that was kind of the heart of it.
Yeah.
And there was everything you would expect to have. There would be, Japanese American hotels, restaurants, dry goods stores, clothing stores, doctor's office, dentist, um, a photographer. Actually, he was one of the most interesting things to study when I was doing my research, because of our crazy immigration policy. The way that many of the immigrant Japanese men got wives was kind of a analog version of Match.com. But instead of having a computer algorithm hook you up with people who may be acceptable, you took a picture of yourself in formal clothing and then sent it back to your parents in Japan, and mom and dad were the algorithm, and they would go around to their friends and say, "Oh, I've got a son, you've got a daughter," so that was all
How
down
can we
there.
make this happen?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
right.
again, and if you want to dive down that rabbit hole, that's fascinating too. Let me tell you about how that shapes the community. But to your question, uh, this is all gone. After the war, it is gone. The property, if it's rented, obviously the rent lapse, and somebody else takes it over. In many cases, if it's property that is owned, and here's a kicker for you. Uh, it is seized by the state. It's the formal term, I believe, is escheated, but I think that's right. But it's seized by the state for failure to pay property taxes, which they obviously cannot do because they're in a concentration camp.
Right.
So it just goes to somebody else. It's seized by the state and sold at auction. And when most of the Japanese Americans come back from the camps, they don't have the resources to mount a legal challenge to try to sue to get their property back. And as we talked about last time, there are a few instances where white neighbors would take care of the property, and turn it back over when Japanese returned. But that's few and far between. It's a rare
Yeah.
occurrence. Um, and in San Diego itself, I'm sure it happened more than once, but the one I'm most familiar with is there was a nursery, plant nursery, owned by the Asakawa family, kind of at the base of the hill before the University of San Diego. It's called Presidio Nursery, and it was owned by the family of the mentor of one of my father's mentors growing up, and they did sue, I believe, and then they were able to get the nursery back. But for the most part, farms gone, businesses gone, houses gone. It was just that. So, and again, most of their property looted. So,
Well, so for the most part, so Japanese families are returning
mhm.
and they're finding not only do they have no resources, little to no cash, I would imagine, nothing more than the clothes on their back, what luggage they are carrying back from the encampment wherever they were, but they're returning to find like no foundation whatsoever for them to land into. Was so the Japanese American districts or neighborhoods, um well, let's see. So they wouldn't have had claim to any of those, or well, they would have had claim, but they couldn't mount the legal defense, to your point. But did they attempt then? So effectively, the fact that there was a neighborhood is it's like it never even happened. It was all washed away because
Yes,
anybody who's in those properties is by definition not a Japanese American immigrant or descendant. They're all gone.
yes, that's correct. Okay, so I've got a story that again is purely anecdotal. I've never done. I'm not
Yeah.
a
Okay.
sociologist. I've never done any big community research on this, but it's just an anecdote. Speaking of the Asakawa family, old Moto, just in passing, because again, he was a family friend. He was also, by the way, the first Japanese American Eagle Scout in San Diego. Um,
Okay.
so,
Okay. No
so,
kidding.
and again, a mentor of my father. So, anytime my dad wanted us to do something for the community that my brother and I were kind of like, I don't want to do the work, he would play the
Hmm.
Moto card. He'd say, "Boys, Moto was wondering if," I'm like, "Oh God, we can't say no to Moto.
It's happening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've got to do it." But anyway, I just in conversation, one day after a family dinner, I asked him, so, the old neighborhood, Moto, it never reformed. I mean, and I asked him pretty much what you were asking me. Why not? What happened? And he basically said what I said, that we didn't have the wherewithal to do it. And then at the end, he kind of chuckled to himself, this kind of grim chuckle, and goes, and you know, I think we also didn't want to make it too easy for them the next time this happened. And I kind of went quiet, the next time, Moto, So I
Yeah.
mean, and he kind of chuckled it off and never spoke of it again. But I think this is one of the long-term effects of the internment, that there was a this kind of feeling in the back of the minds of many of those, especially who were adults who went through this, were like, if they could do this to us once, they could come after us again. Which I think in the next generation, in what they call the Sansei, um, might have been also the motivation for like a lot of the civil rights work. One, to kind of get reparations for their parents and grandparents' generation, but also it was, yeah, even if they didn't think it through, like we were on the last session, didn't think it through constitutionally and legally, just kind of from a gut feeling, they were like, oh yeah, this could happen again. So yeah,
So this is not, at least for you in your position, um, and given our distance from the time now, this is not a fair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And I
yeah, go
suppose
for it.
answer it to the best extent you can. Like, how do you, or well, so we know. So I finished George Takei's memoir,
Hmm.
um, which I still, they called us enemy. I still highly recommend folks read it, and we talk about it in the first episode or the first part of this discussion. But do we have any idea, like, how many people or what proportion maybe of folks really wanted to return home, quote unquote, and try to live again as Americans versus those? We know that there's some number that were repatriated, quote unquote, even folks that had never been to Japan, that took a ship to Japan because the US at one time sort of offered this avenue for you to essentially self-identify as alien and then leave. And in some
Yes.
cases, people might have been angry enough or disenfranchised enough, or certainly felt like they had no other choice to just leave the US and go to a country they didn't even know, because they might be more welcome there. Do we have any sense how much of the community said, I'm done trying it in the US, I'm going to go to Japan, versus those that stayed? And I guess the next question is then, why would you stay?
That's a good question. So yes, we do have numbers. Unfortunately, I don't have them off the top of my head.
Okay.
The repatriation number, I know, when compared to the rest of the community, is very small. There was a very, very small number of people who actually volunteered for repatriation. And as far as, surprisingly, as far as those who wanted to come back, and again, I don't have exact numbers off the top of my head, but an overwhelming majority of them actually wanted to come back. This was their home. They had put a lot of work in their life into building businesses, and farms and a family life here. And so a lot of them did come back, and some did go elsewhere for a while. So some went, some came right back. Some, went somewhere else for a couple of years, sometimes up to a decade or so, but then eventually kind of drifted back to San Diego. Well, I say San Diego because that's where I do my research, but
Yeah.
back to California and the West Coast. Um, but most of them wanted to come back. And what happens after the war is this period of really hardcore assimilation where the Japanese begin, like the Issei and Nisei, again, the first and second generation, who were fully adults during the internment, they kind of suppress it. And suppress their, I don't want to say they suppress their memories because I don't know what's going on inside of their heads, but they don't talk about it. Um, and they do their best to become American, and especially the Issei become very self-conscious about the fact that they might not speak English without an accent, that kind of thing. I know there's an example again of my grandfather's friend. who his father was Issei. And even though before the war, this guy had run his own farm and had done business with American businessmen and had no problem, he felt very self-conscious after the war and always wanted one of his American-born children there to kind of talk for him when they were
Mhm.
doing business. And when it comes to the Sansei, like my mom's generation, the third generation, uh, for the most part, at least in their early life, they grew up ignorant. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Ignorant as in they did not know that
Sure. Yep.
they did not know about this. Their parents and grandparents didn't talk about it. And it wasn't until like the 1960s and the civil rights movement that it really kind of comes out. So so yeah, that's really what happens after the war. And then this is exacerbated, I think, by the fact that again, the physical neighborhoods are gone. Um, the physical center of Japanese American life. You still have the churches, which, like in many communities, play kind of the linchpin
Mhm.
of community activity. You still have community organizations like the Japanese American Citizens League, who sponsored all sorts of activities. Uh, but again, as someone who's not a sociologist, I can't speak super specifically to this, but
Yeah.
just from my observations and growing up in the community, I think the lack of the physical neighborhood, as well as this push to assimilate, really, it really kind of damaged the community structure.
So we talked in the first episode, and we've talked a couple times about your particular family's situation. Every family's unique, but certainly yours, the timing of when your mother's family left town and then where your father enters into the picture and how you even get into researching this in the first place. Um, well, maybe it's not indicative of the typical episode in this whole internment story. I'm still curious to the extent you could speak to it. How then do the successive generations of families impacted by this remember, or are they not over time? So if it's that difficult, and we see this certainly with veterans returning from the war, folks that come back from wartime experiences don't want to talk about it. If you're coming back from an internment imprisonment experience, not wanting to talk about it, we can certainly understand, I think, why that would be the case. But then how does that history live on through the family, or does it not? And or is that a goal, in fact, to somehow get so far past it it's like it didn't happen?
Okay, no, that's an excellent question. Um, So I think what's happened, especially since the 1960s, and we have to really give a lot of credit to, again, kind of my mom's generation, the Sansei, that they do not want this forgotten, that they do want it researched. They want the stories, they want the stories first recorded because we're, like many people of that generation, we're losing them. We're losing these stories. So there's been a real push to try to to record and save these stories and save this evidence. And then there's been a real push for education. And again, I'm talking in the broadest sense. As you said,
Mhm.
obviously every family is different and every individual is different. I mean, if I may indulge in a slight side story,
Yeah.
this was just a few years ago, but I ran into my first Japanese American student who did not give a crap about the internment. I'm sure there was something else going on in their life. They were kind of contemptuous of being in class at all. But
Mhm.
I'm thinking, okay, we're going to get to the internment, and this is probably something, that they can relate to and affects their family. Yeah, this kid couldn't care less. So, like I said, everybody's different. But I would say that's obviously an outlier.
Well, so an outlier, yes, but I'm curious. So from your standpoint, couldn't care less because he or she wasn't affected, they didn't think, or just or they were, like their family was affected, but they're like, meh, in the
I have,
past,
it's a good question. I have no
do you
idea.
know? Okay.
I have this. I mean, because again, it's just my general, just my general observations after now. Oh, Jesus, 31 years of being a classroom teacher, if
Yeah.
you include the high school time, like when I was teaching you.
Mhm.
Um, Generally, when I discuss the internment, obviously it's very, to many students, they get really into it. They're fascinated. They're like, oh my God, this actually happened. And then, students from minority backgrounds seem to be more interested, even if they're not Japanese American. And then
Mhm.
Asian students, even if they're not Japanese, are really interested because, like, wow, we're talking about an Asian issue. So it kind of goes. But like I said, this was just a weird outlier. So I guess that's
Yeah.
to your point that everybody's different. Uh, but again, generally, the overall push of the community has been again to first preserve the stories and then spread the stories. Make sure this is not forgotten, and especially to amongst the current generation of activists in the community. Um, Many of us are of the opinion that we're seeing too many similarities with what happened to our parents and grandparents or great grandparents. Now I'm getting old. That this should not happen again. That
Yeah.
some of us are kind of trying to raise the warning flag, saying, "Hey, this is not happening." So I think that's the long-term legacy of the internment, for this current generation. It's something that needs to be remembered and studied.
So this is a pretty clear and obvious segue to lessons learned for today, but I need to take a quick sidestep. So,
Sure.
um, and I suppose you could call it a taboo, but you also talked about, even students of Asian descent, not Japanese, they would still engage on this because it's an Asian American issue. Um, but so what happens going into Korea? Like, I mean, there's 5 years or so between the end of World War II in the Pacific and the
Hmm.
start of the US's whatever you'll call it campaign on the Korean Peninsula. Like, is there any fear that, oh, we're going to do this all over again? Because
Oh.
particularly for, let's say, the subset of folks that can't quite tell the difference between Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese, which is sort of, I mean, it's become a running joke in some places, but I don't know. At the end of the day, like, are people afraid this is going to happen again so soon
Not
after?
during Korea that I have heard. There was no real talk of it. Um, Yeah, I've never heard any evidence of that. Now, was there anti-Asian racism during Korea? Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you
Yeah.
can just, listen to the interviews, read soldiers' diaries or letters and the way they refer, especially to the North Koreans and the Chinese. Like, okay, wow, that's, I mean, granted, you're in a war, granted, yes, they're the enemy, but you're still like, wow, that's pretty racist, man.
Mhm.
But at least back here in America, there does not seem to be the same um, yeah, let's lock them all up. We can't because you can't tell a good one from a bad one kind of thing. I again, this is not an area of super detailed study I have done, but just as a historian, uh, my guess would be it's because it's become more ideological than racial. It's the Cold War. It's those horrible communists, and
Yeah.
also there was a big push after World War II in both Germany and Japan to kind of rehabilitate at least rehabilitate West Germany and the West
Mhm.
Germans because we needed them as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, and then rehabilitate kind of in the eyes of the American people Japan because we need them as a bulwark against communist China, the PRC. So that may be why we don't see the same kind of racial hysteria for Korea that we saw during World War II.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're a white with red hair but a card carrying communist, you might be under a lot more suspicion than you would be at this point, even speaking Korean on the street or Japanese on
Right.
the street. Um, there's a couple of different places I'm tempted to go, but I won't for the sake of continuity. So, okay, so why first the softball? Why do you
Hmm.
continue to teach the internment in this period of U.S. history, and then why should we care at all, particularly those not affected by it? So my family was not directly affected by it. In fact, my
Right.
family wasn't in the U.S. at the time. But why should we care in spite of that?
Okay, good. So,
Assuming we should, I'm going to assume the
oh
answer is
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Either that or I've wasted 30 years of my life, man.
Yeah, right.
That's kind of grim. Um, so why do I keep teaching this? Well, one, it's just my passion. It's it's something I've dedicated a lot of my life to. But I do think that just because of the reasons we spoke about last time, this particular issue still has relevance to us because of 9066. Again, it goes back to the fact that the government assumed these powers and expressed them in such a broad way. It's like I said in the last time in 9066, they didn't even designate who the target was. It was just the target was whoever the military thought needed to be the target, you
Hmm.
know. And that is terrifying. Um, that's just, that's one of the reasons. I mean, this kind of answers both of your questions. Why I teach about the internment specifically, because in many ways it's kind of like the use of the atomic bomb. I mean, we did it. You know what I mean? There's lots of talk after the war about, the atomic bomb, but we got to remember we're the only nation who's actually used it against a civilian population. We use it,
Hmm.
use it twice. Um, and so, by the same token, this whole issue of 9066 and this massive assumption of government power, we have done it, and the court has upheld it. And even though 9066 itself was rescinded, constitutionally, the power's still there. And and you mentioned last time the first Gulf War. Uh, I don't know how to frame this as a good thing or a bad thing, but during the first Gulf War, there actually was a senator, I believe, who brought up the proposal to reopen the concentration camp at Bismarck, I think. I think it was, but it was. I mean, and even cited the Japanese-American internment. Said, well, we did it for World War II, and fortunately, that got shot down right away. Everybody kind of howled this guy down and said, no, no, you're insane, you're insane.
So he
Stop.
was proposing we were going to reopen it and lock up Iraqi Americans. So what
Yeah,
were we
not
going
even
to?
Iraqi Americans, not even that specific. And again, I'm this is over 30 years in the past, and I haven't looked
Yeah,
at it recently. I just remember this being in the paper as a God, I could barely drink legally, as a young man.
yeah, we're right.
Um, um, but it wasn't even as specific as Iraqi is just basically Arab looking people was kind of the subtext. I don't remember the exact terminology, but it was along those lines. And like I said, okay, that's bad. This guy even brought it up, but it's good that he got howled down.
Right.
Um, but then again, there was after President Trump's first election, there was I can't remember if the guy was a state or federal official, but he actually defended the internment. This is like when during Trump's whole like I'm going to have travel bans kind of thing, and
Yeah.
this guy talked about, well, we did this to the Japanese, and that seemed to work out all right, and I'm just like, wow. So to me, this just screams. This is again both why I keep teaching this and why we should care, because these ideas obviously come up again. I mean, I'll
They
give the
keep
devil their
surfacing.
due.
Yeah.
These guys know the history they want to know. Anyway, the useful parts to them. Again, I don't want to switch gears to the immigration debate too much, but you'll notice in the immigration debate today, those who are these virulent, kind of racist, anti-immigrant types always
Mhm.
harken back to 1924. In 1924, we had all these great laws. I'm like, oh yeah, we had the National Origins Act, which was co-authored by the Ku Klux Klan,
Yeah.
and really cut off, foreign immigration to the United States. Um, so, I mean, like this is in total. I mean, beyond the internment, this
Yeah.
to
Oh
me, this
yeah.
kind of touches on everything, and this is why I teach what I teach, and why I teach the way I do.
So okay, I'm just going to ask you the questions I want to ask you because
Yeah,
it's my
go
show,
ahead.
right? That's the point. So,
Well, and
okay,
we've
so
known each other what, like almost 25, 30 years now.
well,
So,
yeah, that's yeah. So if yeah, folks are bored, you can fast forward or not, but I think this will be interesting still. So, did you ever or have you ever in your classes run into students who would defend it? Or that one person who's like, I think this was a good idea.
I never have. Um, And I think a big part of it is obviously, since you and I are just talking, many
Yeah.
people may assume I'm your traditional history teacher and I lecture, which I do a little bit. However, what I've done for the last 20 years or so is I've started teaching with documents.
Mhm.
So that's like why I sent you my sabbatical project to look
Yeah.
at. And obviously, I don't use all of that stuff. That's way too specialized for a survey level class, but I use
Well,
parts of it.
not all 150 pages.
Yeah, exactly. So what
But it's
happens when you,
but primary documents though. I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Anyway.
I so when we do that, um it's hard for people to say, oh, that's just your opinion. You're just some liberal with an agenda. And I mean, obviously, yes, I am liberal. You know, I lean pretty far to the left, especially in America.
Hmm.
But when I say, look, this is out of the horse's mouth. You know, this is exactly what the military was saying. This is the response of the community. This is what the Supreme Court said. And we do look again briefly, obviously in survey class. I'm not going to make them read the whole decision, but
Yeah.
we look at the Korematsu decision, for example, and then we look at the dissents, especially Murphy and Roberts' two dissents, is to how can I put this? To your point about someone who defends it, you know, tries to defend these things. One of the common defenses of both the internment and other bad behaviors of our country in the past is always, oh, but that's just how everybody felt. No, you know, nobody knew
Hmm.
any better. You're engaged in historical relativism, and I point out, no, there were people at the time who were pretty vocally saying this was not cool, and including two Supreme Court justices. You know,
Yeah.
so again, to your point, about I've never had pushback directly. No, I've had some online pushback, and but I mean it's online, it's trolls. What do you
Yeah. You're
expect?
always going to get somebody. Yep.
Yeah.
So then, okay. So then the other question that's purely just for me, uh, Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
So how does the community respond to the atomic bombings? It's one thing to say the war is over. It's another to talk about how it ended.
Yeah, that's really a tough one, um, because that is a very individualized question. Um, because you know some people have family still, you know, in those cities. Um, yeah, that's a good question, and I will have to plead ignorance on it. I don't know if there's been any real talk about it. Generally, the feeling, and again, this is a very general, broad overview, is one of kind of horror and dismay at the level of destruction,
Yeah.
especially as time goes on and the government releases more information. And, you know, it's just on a human level of, oh my God, you know, look at what has happened. And then on a personal level, because like I said, many people, you know, had, you know, friends and relatives still, you know, in those cities. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a hard one to answer.
So then, okay, so how about your individual take? So not
Hmm.
necessarily not asking for a political position per se, but just as a historian and then as someone, well, and as an American with an interest in this question, especially as to whether we would ever use a nuclear weapon again. What is your take on the bombings of Japan, whether we should or should not have done it, and
Oh,
if that
wow.
was and the debate I know is complicated, and there's still debate to this day
Yeah.
about what Truman was thinking about and what he knew, what we didn't know, whether the invasion of the home islands really was going to be as bad as people assumed. There's a whole lot you can't, well, you don't want to take for granted, but
Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity and just ask you what you think to the extent you thought about it.
Yeah. To the extent I've thought of it, well, here's the thing. Wow. So I do think a potential invasion of the Japanese home islands was going to be as bad as everybody thought. You know,
Good.
you know, even just look at how bad Normandy was, and we were hanging on by our fingernails, and you know, many people tend to forget that, and people tend to forget that Eisenhower carried what was that he carried that message in his pocket that in case the invasion failed, you know, he
Hmm.
was going to take full responsibility. Man, he carried that for like a month or something afterwards to whip it
I,
out in case they had to withdraw, and it was a failure.
I talk
Um,
about that second letter every June 6th because
yeah,
it's just such a stark reminder of like what he would have felt in the moment, not knowing everything that would have happened, right?
right. And you know,
Yeah.
and again, since World War II has such a resonance in America, we
Mhm.
tend to think of our victory, especially you know first in you know in Europe and then in the Pacific, as kind of a foregone conclusion. But you're right. At the time, it was like, man, this might not work. So in that respect, I'm like, I can understand without condoning the military impulse to say, yeah, we've got to use this weapon, you know, that we have to. Although, I mean, I'm not a military specialist, so I don't want to get into, could they have just continued the blockade
Mhm.
and just done a conventional bombing campaign, continued the conventional bombing campaign against Japan? I mean, yes, I suppose, but again, it would have been costly. And then there's the political element to consider because some historians have argued, and I kind of agree with them that we wanted to end the war quickly before the Soviets got too involved in the Asian half of the war. Because remember,
That's another
remember
great.
the U.S. was pretty much on its own for the most part. A little bit of help from
Mhm.
the French, a little bit of help from the British, but we were pretty much the big players in the Pacific. And the Soviets were obviously more concerned with their Western Front, with the Eastern Front, and from the perspective of the Americans. And they really didn't pay Asia much mind. And then at the Tehran conference, they make that deal where the Soviets are going to get involved in the war and help us against Japan. And so there was a lot of talk about we need to get this done before the Soviets, get too involved, and especially once they get troops there. Eisenhower. I joke in class because we read a letter of his talking to a friend about him advising Truman that, yeah, we need to do this, not so much because we got to defeat Japan per se. It's more we don't want the Red Army involved. And he's
Mhm.
basically like the Red Army is kind of like a vampire. Once you invite it in, man, there's no getting it out. So he wanted to get it done quickly. So I think there's some truth to that. So like all big questions in history, it's complicated.
Yeah.
You're never going to be able to say absolutely this was a military justified and moral question. Uh, uh, yeah, but that's just my observations on it, I guess,
Yeah.
more than my opinion.
Okay. Well, no, I'll take that. And I suppose so. Then, just for fun, are you the type of historian that um, engages in the counterfactual, so the what if scenario, or are you the type that generally eschews that because one, it's hard, it's difficult
Yeah.
to even think about, and two, it's almost well, it's irrelevant to trying to understand what did happen. So, for instance, in my mind, I think of well, if the war in the Pacific persisted, we have an idea perhaps of what would have happened if we had to share occupation and reconstruction of Japan with the Soviets, um, because Berlin became a decades long crisis.
Right.
And so, would Japan or parts, or perhaps not just Tokyo, but would Japan as a whole have become that way? Do you engage in that kind of thing or do you avoid it?
Well, generally, just because I'm working at the survey level, I try to avoid it. I will try to answer a question like that if it's posed by a student because it shows their thinking. And God, that's something I want to encourage. I'm like, yes, you're thinking critically. Well done. You're trying to logic out what might have happened. So I'm like, okay, I'll indulge this. But generally, I try to stick to the facts as we know them, and then if we do any kind of what ifs, it's based on interpretations of the facts, because sometimes the facts are fuzzy. Sometimes we don't have all of them, and we have to use inference to figure out, what was the actual end game, or what was the motivation behind something. Um, and again, just because the teaching of history has become so politicized, that's why I always fall back on documents when I'm teaching. And I'm
Yeah,
like, well, what does the documents, what evidence do we have?
right.
Although, kind of on a side note, when I start the semester, I remind my students that history is not written in stone. It's not immutable. That a new piece of evidence can completely, rewrite the way we know history, literally, or even a new way of thinking about it. If someone comes up with a premise that no one's ever come up with before,
Mhm.
um, a way to interpret the data, um, that can literally change history. And some people don't like that in class because they've had the coach for the history teacher before this, and they're used to thinking in terms of history is where you memorize names and dates and events. And I'm like,
Yeah.
no, it's an analytical practice. So yeah,
So then let me get your response to this. I keep coming up with tangents. I was listening to
that's
an
fine.
interview. Do you know who Bart Ehrman is?
Vaguely, sorry.
New Testament biblical scholar.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And by his own admission, somewhat of an anomaly. He is an agnostic, or
Hmm.
actually, I think he would self identify as an atheist who studies the Bible. He's written several books on it. But he said something in an interview, it's one of those things that makes sense when you hear it, but you're like, it's never occurred to me to think of it that way. He said that history is not it's not merely a record of what happened, it is us recording what we can establish about what happened.
Yes.
So the best we can do is write down what we think we know.
Hmm.
We will never by definition know. And so to the extent that you writing a history book today about anything, it will never be a straight camera, microphone, video recording, if you will, of what happened. We simply cannot do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's why I tell my classes that history is mutable. It
Yeah.
can change when you discover new things. Although, as a historian, you should do your best to use the most accurate data to interpret it as objectively as possible. Um, but Yeah, I mean, that's actually touching on a whole different, not different, but kind of a related discipline, called historiography, right? That's the
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
study of the writing of history. And when and obviously I don't touch on that too much in my freshman level classes
I wouldn't
because
imagine. Yeah.
it makes the students, brains explode. But I do touch on it. I use the more egregious examples of bad history, like the Daughters of the Confederacy and the whole Lost Cause thing, for example,
Hmm.
where the Daughters of Confederacy are kind of this proto version of Moms for Liberty, except they succeed beyond the wildest expectations of anybody, where they're able to take control of school boards and curricula, and they even have this entire kind of grading rubric they call a measuring rod for textbooks that they insist school boards use when considering adopting history textbooks. And of course, it makes the Confederacy looks good. It downplays slavery and the brutality of slavery in the
Hmm.
role of, well, pretty much anything. Um, yeah. So I always use that when I talk to my students about historiography. Or that hideous elbow room video that ABC Schoolhouse Rocks did. Did we watch that in your class? I forget.
Oh, this sounds familiar.
Yes, it's about the expansion of the Trans-Mississippi West, where you've got the guys singing about elbow room, and it was all, and they even use the term manifest destiny. It's like the West was meant to
Yes.
be, it was manifest destiny,
Yes.
and
That jingle rings a bell.
okay,
Now I'm
yeah,
having
yeah.
flashbacks. Yes.
So, where obviously you can study it from two perspectives. You can study that as history, as the actual history of American expansion into the West, even though it's a very simplified version, obviously. Or you could do historiography, being okay, in the 1970s, how were we teaching children about our expansion of the Trans-Mississippi West? And what does that tell us about how in the 1970s we viewed things like race, especially like the Native Americans and African Americans when it comes to, like, the treatment of Native Americans and the issue of slavery.
Hmm.
What does that say about American imperialism? Because it is definitely not couched in phrases of imperialism and conquest. It's couched in phrases of it's just natural expansion. It just had to happen. And
Yeah. Well, and we're the best ones to take it
yeah,
over, and
exactly.
look at how
And
much prosperity and money we can make.
so 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 yeah. And again, to get back to our topic of the internment, um, for at least when I was a kid, they barely touched it. In middle school and high school, we didn't. Um, I think by the time you were in high school, it was a little bit better. But even still, it doesn't get much play for all that the right howls and screams about why are they telling the stories of all these different people.
Hmm.
It still doesn't get as much, I think, as much play as it should, given its effect on America and given its potential damage it could do, from the precedents that were set.
So I've put it off long enough.
Go
So
ahead.
we talked last episode, or in, yeah, part one, about and I think on air, on recording, about the state of Utah where I
Hmm.
live, and ongoing discussions with Homeland Security about taking over warehousing type facilities to use as ICE detention centers. Are we now, although the well, I do my best not to pay attention to most news, to be honest, but of course the news cycles so often that we went from the Iran war to now our political tiff with the patriarch of Rome, and then we're going to continue to go through other things. Were we seeing a prelude to something like the internment? Is it the same kind of thing happening? What do you make of um, the ICE raids, for the lack of a better
Hmm.
term? What do you make of our current moment where we seem very, very adamantly now? Muslim travel ban, you brought that one up. That was a hot ticket during Trump's first term. The second term seems to be all about Latin America, immigrants across the southern border, etc. What do you make of all this? Where does this go? Is this only going to get worse, or is it going to get worse before it gets better?
Wow, that's again just because, and again I'm gonna I'm gonna jump in with both feet here. Just because Trump is so unstable. I'm sorry. The guy is just because he seems to be. I mean, I don't think this guy's playing 5D chess. I mean, he's just a toddler who's reacting. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say that.
That is
Uh,
the argument people are
you
making, that
know,
he's so super strategic.
yeah, no.
Yeah, okay.
It's yeah. So just so that's my way of saying I don't want to prognosticate because God knows what this man's going to do. However, I think I can safely say if we are not, right now in the middle of kind of an internment scenario, we are internment adjacent, and we have been for a while. The opening of these big camps, these big detention centers, and this whole business with the whole alligator Alcatraz thing in Florida. The I forget, they gave it a macho sounding military code name, but whatever they did in Minneapolis, they had a name for it, like Enduring Justice or something.
I thought it was epic.
Epic,
Yeah, it
yeah.
was.
Well, Epic Fury is the one for Iraq, right? Or Iran, rather. Um,
That's right. Epic Fury is, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
But I think like I said, we've been seeing it for a while. These, mass roundups,
Metro
um,
Surge.
Metro Surge, that was it. Yeah.
I, yeah.
Um,
Anyway, okay.
going after people without a judicial warrant.
Mhm.
And right now we were just talking, I don't think we recorded it, about the Trump campaigning in his first term about getting rid of FISA because there are some serious civil liberties concerns, to now he's pushing Congress to extend FISA, a clean extension, right? Don't put any limits on the government or
Mhm.
anything like that. Um, I think we could slide downhill into an internment-esque situation very, very easily if we're not kind of there already. Again, the mass roundups kind of point to that. The fact that they're grabbing people who do not have criminal records, because, well, remember, and I know there's this argument about, oh, if they're in this country illegally, undocumented, they've broken the law, and it's like, dude, that's a misdemeanor. That is a
Mhm.
misdemeanor.
Right. That's right.
And then many people are in this country and have done the right thing. They have applied for asylum, and it's not their fault our system is screwed up, but again, to your point, I believe the Stephen Millers of the world just salivate at the idea of they would love that. Hence this business, like, in Utah, of ICE, of Homeland Security, trying to rent warehouse space.
Mhm.
And again, this is not the only place to do it. So, to the
Yeah.
second part of your question, what happens next? A lot of that's going to depend on how the American people react. And I believe truly this is where political activism is going to have to come to the fore. Mass protest, government action. So again, local municipalities pushing back and saying, "Oh, guess what? We're going to turn off the power and water, and good luck with that next."
Yeah.
Um, it really depends on that, and it might have to go further. I mean, obviously, I am not in any way, shape, or form advocating violence, but something like a general strike, like they did to bring down the dictatorial regimes in Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold
Mhm.
War. If every single person says, screw you, I'm staying home, and the economy comes to a crashing halt, that'll get people's attention. So, yeah, a lot of it depends on what we do as a people. And this kind of might be one of our big defining moments. Are we going to go along with this and allow this to happen, or are we going to push back?
I don't have a good way to segue to this, so
Yeah,
I'm just going to
that's okay.
not.
These are pretty heavy issues,
Yeah.
man.
Well, you have me thinking about, I mean, so civic engagement,
Hmm.
the idea that there's, well, even my generation, a millennial, the millennial generation, I know plenty of people that just don't really know enough history or have thought much about what it means to have an ICE detention center down the street, like why
Right.
that's bad or what that really means, or are they really rounding up only the criminals? We have documentation of them rounding up U.S. citizens, military veterans, people on the in the pipeline for green cards, etc. Um, but you also you talk about, you post about from time to time, life in the world of education, life in
Yes.
higher ed. Um, for a student, so from a, I guess from a parent's perspective, maybe my kids are still young, but um, is college worth it? And is it
Uh,
doing what it's supposed to be doing? You can answer those in either order.
Yikes.
No rush.
So I do firmly believe that college is worth it, and I would also like to give my own personal plug for the classical liberal education. Again, not
Okay.
liberal in the modern sense, like hug a tree, save the whales liberal. Even though those are good things. Don't get
Yeah.
me wrong, I'm an environmentalist on top of all this.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean liberal as in broad, that you should kind of fall back on the ancient Greek and Roman ideal of education, where it should be broad to give you a good foundation for whatever you want to do. And that's why, so for example, I teach at a community college and we have career and technical education. So we have welding programs, we have auto mechanics, we have HVAC, we have oh gosh, we have a master, or not a master, but like an apprentice or journeyman carpenter.
Hmm.
We have this whole series of things, but
Carpentry, plumbing,
yeah,
electrical, all those
yeah.
types of, yeah. Yep.
But still, and I've had students in my classes in these programs, but they still have to take kind of the basics. They still have to take, math, English, and at least some kind of civics. And I think that is definitely worth it. One, not because so much of the knowledge, because facts, it's one of those things where like use them or lose them kind of thing. Like, one of
Hmm.
the reasons I know so much about the internment is I've studied it my whole life and I talk about it, I teach it, so, but there's other things that I learned as a young man, and I've forgotten just because I don't go back to it. But here's the thing, I know where to find it,
Hmm.
right? I know where to go back and find it. So I think that yes, it's worth it, but I think we're also in a really dangerous place in education for a lot of reasons. And one of them, unfortunately, has to do with history and civics. And, the old saying is never attribute to malice that which can be perfectly explained by incompetence.
Hmm.
But for one reason or another, starting in the K-12 system for the last like 50 years, I think they have, people, politicians, uh, some parents groups even have really gutted civics education. Um, this is a story I like to tell, and again, it's anecdotal, but I think it's representative. Where I had a student a couple years ago complain to me, "This is professor, the textbook is really difficult." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm okay. I'm sorry. What's difficult about it?" And he says, "Well, it assumes that you already know certain things." I'm like, "Oh, okay, all right. So can you give me an example?" And he says, and since we were working on the Constitution, it was my early U.S. class. He says, "Well, it automatically assumes you know the difference between Congress and the Senate." And of course, I had to explain to him, okay, now
Yep.
Congress is both houses, the Senate is part
Yeah.
of it, and here's what makes the Senate, here's what makes the House the House. But it's just basic foundational information. And obviously, the kid doesn't have to be a constitutional scholar,
Right.
but they should at least know the basics. And even like vocabulary and reading, one of the problems I've seen is like I have a in-class activity I do with my early history classes where it's the Constitution, where first we go over the major political philosophies of the time about government power and responsibility and the role of the people. And it's basically I make it simple for them. Hamilton versus Jefferson, even though we know that's oversimplification, but
Yeah,
that works
yeah,
for that. As a teacher, sometimes you got to do it.
yeah.
And then I kind of start them off uh, and then I put them in groups and I say, okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to read the Constitution together, article by article, section by section. So like Article 1, Section 1. First of all, what does that mean? What does that mean to a normal person?
Hmm.
And then which of the two major philosophies does it fit under and why? And so in the old days,
Hey, okay.
about 10, 15 years ago, um, I could spend two full class sessions, so basically 3 hours, and my students could finish all of it and at least get through the 15th Amendment, which is kind of where, the first half of U.S. history ends. I'm fine. Today, they cannot get through Article 3. I mean, they can't even finish the body of the Constitution together. And it's for a lot of reasons. One, the vocabulary, I can see them struggling with the words. And obviously, during this whole process, I don't just throw them off the deep end. I say, look, you guys go over it together. And then if you can't figure something out or have a question, raise your hand. I'll come around and we'll discuss it and I'll kind of help you through it. Um,
Are you looking for the groups to agree necessarily, or just to have the debate or to have the discussion? Article 1, Section 1 is saying this.
well,
And
generally,
then,
so for the first part, like the interpretation is pretty simple because it's all mechanics. This is what the government does, and does not do.
yeah.
The philosophical part, I'm totally fine with them disagreeing.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense? If
Which,
they
yeah.
is this a Hamiltonian kind of strong federal government, limits on the states, limits on democracy, or is this a Jeffersonian kind of, limited federal government, more power to the states, more rights for the people, blah blah blah. Um, so I guess the philosophy part, and again, you're right, the debate is important, but even just the kind of nuts and bolts mechanics they can't do, or a lot of them, I guess I'm being unfair, a lot of them can't do.
Yeah.
And it's really worrying. And then to add to the worry, there are forces in education, supposedly liberal forces, who are doing things like right now we're having a fight at my college about removing the American History and Institutions requirement from the GE requirement for graduation, making it more of an elective rather than a requirement. And really quickly, one of the arguments they use is, uh, all you guys do is talk about old white men. I'm like, okay, obviously from our discussion right here, you can see that's not true.
Yeah.
But even even if we did, you can still meet that requirement by taking the two class series for Chicano studies, African American studies, or American Indian studies, because the 101, 102, and all of those also deal with, in the first half, the Constitution and civil rights, and in the second half, specifically California, the California political system.
Yeah.
But but there's this talk about, oh, they already got this in high school. I'm like, if they did, it didn't stick, man.
It didn't
If
work. Yeah.
so again, because I think the K-12 system has been disadvantaged purposely for at least the last 50 years, and making it harder and harder. I mean, and again, when I say this, I am in no way criticizing the K-12 teachers. Those people are heroes, um, especially those in the public system. Those people, I mean, they're
E-
saints and heroes. It
Yeah.
is it is the system and the administration and the politicians.
Even in relatively healthy districts. I mean, we're quite blessed to be in a healthy school district, and even then, our teachers are paying their own money for various supplies, for tissues, for markers, for all sorts of cleaning supplies. Right? We go through flu season, half the kids are sniffling, and they're paying for Lysol wipes to keep the thing clean because the
Right.
school's not budgeted for it. Um, is this If we were to attempt to fix this, assuming that enough people were serious about it, do we is the focus on K through 12 and on secondary education in particular, or is the community college the place where this pivots, or what role, if any, does the 4-year high-end um, research school play? And of course, in my case, I'm quite biased against the ability of the research university to play a role in this because however jaded your administration is, it's 10 times, 100 times worse in the research university. Like, I can't having worked with mostly engineering majors at Ohio State for 3 years, even to see the ones that wanted to take an elective, say in history, in English, in or a literature course, their programs didn't even allow the time.
Right.
And that's for students who desired it, desired the exposure, and they get to the end of 5 years saying, I don't even want to be an engineer. Like this whole thing sucked, but it was sunk cost at that point.
Right.
So like what do we do about it, and where do we focus attention? Or
Yeah, again, so this is obviously not my academic specialty. This is just
yeah,
me talking as a guy who's been in the educational system. To be fair, though, I have worked, obviously, I've worked at the community college level for 20 years, but as you know, I taught high school. I also, taught middle school, granted in a non-traditional setting, which I think is fantastic. And to be fair, and honestly, I still do. We talked about the fact that I still go back to my roots in outdoor education,
yeah,
experiential education. I teach at the San Diego Zoo every summer. Um, to your point, I think we have to go back to basics. I think we have to go back to the K-12 system. There's just no way that in 2 years a community college can do everything it's supposed to, or even a four-year university if the students don't come prepared. Um, Obviously, in the K-12 system, money is a big part of it. Funding is an issue. But it should be funding for things like reducing class sizes. I mean, we know this because it was, I taught you at a private school, and
yeah,
the class sizes were tiny compared to public school,
oh yeah.
and the student performance reflected that. I mean, we did so well on the AP exams that we actually got a nasty letter from the college board saying that our little tiny school was one of the ones that was throwing the curve because, on the I don't
I
know if
didn't know
people.
that.
Oh yeah, so I don't know if
I
people know
never
this.
knew. Yeah,
So I'll get into a bit of pedagogy here. Um, the AP exams are not graded rather on a set scale. They rewrite the scale every year to give you a perfect bell curve distribution. And so at least in history, the way it works is
okay.
about a week before they grade the essays. What they do is they bring in a small team of very experienced graders, college professors and high school teachers who will take a random sampling of essays, read them, and not grade them, but based on what they get and the results, they will then create the grading rubric everybody else uses based on what is coming in. And then they put, yeah, I know you're going crazy.
I haven't. Yeah, okay. Keep going. Sorry.
And then what they do is then obviously it's not an official grade. The papers go back in their boxes, and then
Right.
1 or 2 days before the official grading, a bigger team of experienced graders come in and they get a random sampling of of student essay responses, and then they use the created rubric to see if it holds up, if it does give them a perfect bell curve, and if it doesn't, they adjust the rubric again, and then they go, they put them back in the boxes, and then they do the official grading based on that rubric. So I guess my point to that is
Okay,
one
I
of
don't
the
feel so good.
reasons, one of the reasons our school got in trouble, not really in trouble, but we got
Yeah.
one, it's kind of this academically passive aggressive letter saying we need to be more inclusive and allow more students to take AP classes, and allow them to stretch themselves, meaning we were being too selective. Although to be fair, at a private school, we were being selective because we didn't want parents getting pissed at us because the kid gets into the AP class and they shouldn't be there because it takes a lot of, self-motivation, as you know.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And
AP
the kid,
Calc was a mistake.
yeah,
Yes.
the kid doesn't have it, and the parents get mad at the teacher, so we just don't want to deal with it, which I admit
Yep.
is kind of selfish.
Yeah.
But to my point again, back to, about the K-12s though, this is where small classes come into the play. You can have more personalized instruction. There's no way some poor K-12 slob can have like six sections of 30 or 40 kids, and give them what they need. That's why at in the public schools, the AP classes, even the AP classes do a lot of memorization and they
Hmm.
do a lot of practice multiple choice tests, but they don't do a lot of practice writing tests like we did at your high school,
Yeah.
because that would physically kill the teacher. There's no way they can do it. So
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
we have to start, and it again goes back to, back to even elementary school. If, they have the students really, we need to put a real concerted effort into making sure they have all of the skills they need. And and again, you can see where policy is making this even worse because now to jump back to community college, California a couple of years just passed a law. The legislature did this to us where they said, "Oh, students are taking too long to get out of community college. They're taking too many classes because they are being put in remedial classes because they don't have the skills. So we will now, by law, say you can't force students, you can't even offer remedial classes."
By
Like,
law
yeah,
now?
by law, yeah.
S- So then what?
I mean, we can offer them for students who volunteer to take them, but we can't say, "Oh, you didn't pass the placement test. You really should take like English 50, the prep class, rather than English
Mhm.
100." We can't do that. And the same thing in math. And now the results are predictable. We have a massive failure rate because the students come unprepared and we can't prepare them. We have to throw them right into, I believe, college algebra, and many of them can't do it. Um, and I get students who, again, a big part of my class is I'm trying to kill so many birds with just my one stone. I have
Mm,
to teach them history, obviously, but I also must teach them critical thinking, and I
mhm.
also must teach them skills like how to write a 5 paragraph essay.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, I literally, have to walk them through the process multiple times and give them all the support material, which again, I am willing to do, and I do. But the success rate is not going to be great just because we can't do this in 2 years. This
So
is a
then
systemic issue.
how is that? So then the state, so the AP thing blows my mind.
Right.
Perhaps I should have known, but I mean, I wouldn't have been paying attention to it. But so that rather, in my mind, directly suggests like that there is no interest in a standard. It's simply because a bell curve then implies you're going to have a similar number every year of students matriculating into a certain set of classes, which then keeps your funding stable. Like, is all of that just based on the money demand
Well,
signal?
that's part of it, but also remember the College Board is out for a buck. They're a business.
Yeah, 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 right.
That's why the APs and the SATs are such a big deal to them.
Yeah.
And so if they had a set standard and too many students didn't, failed and didn't get that college credit, people would not take the AP test. Um, So that's part of it. And again, you can see the danger here is
Maybe they
if you
shouldn't.
have a
Right.
cohort of very talented, very driven, very motivated students, the bell curve is going to slide up. But
Hmm.
if you have a cohort that's not that, it's going to slide down. And
But what gets
yeah.
me, so well, sorry, and I don't. I mean, now I kind of want to know. So based on, I don't know how it works anymore. So this is
Hmm.
all dated, however many couple decades plus when I was in high school. Based on a grade I got on the AP calculus exam,
Right.
I placed into a higher level math than I should have, and I will say that definitively. I should not have started it with math 152 at Ohio State. All of the course numbers have changed. Doesn't matter. Should not have started where I did. But now to learn that my score on that, if a student the year prior or after got an identical score, that means nothing. Like they could have placed into the same class, but they and I could have had a totally different going in set of skills just based
Possibly.
on that year's bell curve
Yeah,
setup.
yeah, possible. Although again, again, complete transparency here, the experience I was describing is I only know for sure they do that in history. And like,
Okay.
I would assume probably like English, the other ones. Although I'm sure they may do something like it. This is one of those things I picked up at a conference where a guy who had been a AP grader for years and years and years was prepping young idiots because it was my second year teaching.
Yeah.
He was
Well,
prepping young idiots for how to teach AP classes, and he said that's how we do it. So that's what you have to keep in mind. And I was like, yikes, that's
so then even worse. So based on taking AP US, and I think it was AP World with you, and then AP English, I got to Ohio State, and this I know has changed because it
Hmm.
certainly was different for my students when I was back there, and it's changing even with the big state schools. But at that time, I placed high enough to not have a history or English requirement at all as an
Yes.
undergrad.
Yeah, because you actually get college full on college credit. Yes.
Right. So that sounds great. Um, but not if the bell curve is such that like half of us don't it can't even put together a cogent 5 paragraph essay, but because all of us were that bad that year,
Yeah.
I would get a 4 or a 5 just because I was best among the weakest.
Yeah, that's true. But again, for your own, again, I can't speak to, well, you had Cobb's, right? You had old Lewis.
Yeah. Yes, I
Yeah,
did. Yeah,
Scooter.
that was hard. That was
Yeah, but
difficult.
no, but that's my point though. I
Yeah.
think, I can only speak to the humanities,
Yeah.
although just knowing the people at that school, they were all pretty good teachers with a few exceptions. Um, if you got a 4 or 5 on the AP test, you personally, I would argue you were ready to move on into even an upper division history class because I have tried using the same material I used with you guys in the 10th grade, not AP stuff,
Yeah.
on some of my community college students, and they floundered. Like I had to create even more scaffolding. So I guess what I'm saying is because of your educational experience at a school with small class sizes, personalized attention, very involved parents, that sort of thing, very
Yeah.
involved faculty, at the cost of our sanity. Uh,
Yeah.
you were able to succeed. Even if the AP is on a sliding scale, you're still going to succeed because you have all of that. And that's kind of my argument for we really need to help out the K-12 system.
Yeah, but
Um,
that's the thing is yeah, I had tons of things working in my favor, not least of which the school I was in, so I could go into an upper division history course and probably survive it and or do, decently well. But then another kid who's coming in next to me, or coming in a year or two later, who might have scored a 4, uh, but on a different part of the curve, could come into that same upper division course and flounder.
Potentially, yes.
And I just don't. So as a university receiving students, so then at Ohio State, when I was receiving students, in Ohio, they had a thing called College Credit Plus. So this other method of taking high school or taking college classes in high school. Lots of states do this kind of a thing. Um, and I'm talking to people who are at risk of failing a math class that they literally took during College Credit Plus. Like they took it in high school,
Mm,
got a C plus B minus, let's say, placed into a course or decided to retake the course. I think you were allowed to to repeat it perhaps without paying money or something, but you certainly couldn't revert, and the university wouldn't let you revert. And they were at risk of failing because, however, it was working in the university in the traditional environment, they couldn't keep up, and they're like, I don't understand what's happening, but there's just so much work and all this stuff, and you dig into, well, life is different here, and you're on your own, you're not your parents' house, all et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
mhm.
But at the end of the day, you couldn't look at any academic transcript basically and make a decision off of. Like I got to the end of that experience and I'm like, I don't know what any of this tells me. I don't know what this means. Like even 4.0 students, like I'm not sure what that means anymore. But anyway, I don't know.
And this is again a problem that's been creeping up. I don't know what's going on like at Ohio or in Utah,
Yeah.
but I know in California we're having a real problem with the whole no zero thing. That students in some this is the K-12 system. Uh, that in some districts, teachers cannot give zeros if the student turns in no work. The lowest they can give them is 50%. And the argument, and which I kind of understand, is if the kid
Mm.
has something going on in their life and they miss the assignment, especially early in the semester, a zero is a hard way to dig yourself out of the hole. But the problem is this has created a whole generation of students, and it continues to create it, where they were able to get away with that. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? Whereas I never understood why they haven't said, well, how about you just do away with late penalties or make the late penalties very minor and just do your best to encourage the student to do the work so they
Yeah.
actually learn it. But we have that problem in the K-12, and we're leaning that way. God help us, at least at my college, where there's a debate. It hasn't been become official yet. It's not policy because it's still in the debate process, where they want to make it where if you get a D in a gen ed class, so not in a class in your major, you get a D in a gen ed class, but your
Mhm.
overall GPA is more than 2.0, the D will count for graduation. And a lot of us are just like, what? Are you
Huh.
kidding me? Um, which again, I don't want to, and again, I don't want to impugn on these people's
Mhm.
motives. They mean well. They want to see
Yeah.
student success, but I'm kind of like, we are defining success differently. You are defining success by they get a piece of paper. I am
Right.
defining success, not even by knowledge, by skills.
It's really the credentialing that they're focused on. Like just get
Yes.
them the degree and get them out the door so they can go get a job or go do the
Yeah.
thing, whatever the thing is.
So,
Um, okay, so
yep,
we've
we've kind of
gotten
gone
off
far afield here.
the internment, yeah. But so as we wind down, I guess what if anything have we missed that you think is worth touching on, or what last thoughts do you have on the Japanese American internment, the Japanese American experience during and after World War II, and and what we should take from it 80 years on? Final
I
thoughts.
think we've hit a lot of it, but I just want to reiterate that this constitutionally, legally, can absolutely happen again, and it can absolutely happen to anybody. And given the proclivities of our current administration, those of us with a higher degree of social visibility, shall we say, are obviously being targeted. I mean, and the Supreme
Mhm.
Court has even kind of signed off on that. So I think we all need to be aware. Um, we all need to be active. And I think this is where civics education is so important because, you need to know what is the most effective way for you to be active, and how many different ways you can be active. Um, and at the same time, we also need to take care of each other and take care of ourselves. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. This is going to be the long war. As my dad called education the long war. It's a
Oh, wow.
30-year rearguard action to defend civilization, is what he
Oh, wow.
said.
Wow. That's a stark image, but yeah, I get it.
And this is coming from a guy who taught for like 42 years.
Hmm.
I'm not going to try and match dad. No, no. Um,
He taught college or
he
what
taught.
levels?
He was like me. He actually taught high school for about 10 years, and part-time community college, like during
Yeah.
the summers and nights, and stuff. And then he
Okay.
was able to make the jump to a community college where he spent, like me, the bulk of his time. But
Yeah. Okay.
I guess that's fate. We all become our fathers. It's horrible. But I even
Yep.
went into the family business in research. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say is, as far as being is kind of both political pragmatism and being kind to each other. I was at a in service. I will say my college does do some things very well, and one of them is we had an in service for how to best help our undocumented students, given everything that's going on.
Mhm.
And one of the things the two there was two the leaders of the in-service said it was given by two gentlemen who are both undocumented and both also finishing up their PhDs. So they're very, very credentialed people.
Wow.
Um, they said, look, all of you are here for the right reason. You are all here to help, and we appreciate that, and that's fantastic. So during our in service, during our discussion, if somebody accidentally uses like the wrong terminology, we don't care. You are here to help, and and I think we need it. Kind of goes back to our discussion in the first episode of, do we call the internment, or do we call it the incarceration?
Yeah.
And I admit, yes, words matter and language matters, but read the situation, my fellow liberals. There's a time to get caught up about language and you didn't use the right term, and there's a time to say, whoa, big picture, we need to fight the big fight here. And not engage in what President Obama once termed as the circular firing squad of uh, there's a circular firing squad of ideological purity that the left often indulges in. And he says we can't do that, and so that's how we kind of have to take care of each other. So if someone says the internment versus the incarceration, I'm like, cool. They still think it was not a good thing and they think it violates the Constitution. That person's an ally.
Yeah.
It's as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well,
So,
it's the
yeah.
so that is, I mean, that's a really good final thought. I don't want to stomp on it. I would say though that's not something you stereotypically hear from the political left, and
Yeah.
even the political right has this same problem too. Like
Yeah.
if you there's terminology problems on both sides, and then people get super stressed if you use the wrong term or simply are ignorant of the terms because you simply don't know, but you want to know. Um, yeah, that's a really good place to end.
Yeah.
Professor Matt Estes of history at Palomar College, Metro San Diego, an expert on the internment, certainly my first choice and go to for asking some of these questions, working on my own project, and then um, my first guest of the new season. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
I'll
It
talk
was
to you soon.
great to talk, Arun.
Thanks.